Hi guys, Mark here. Today's segment is going to cover the tips and tricks of chumming for yellowfin tuna. It's a technique also called block baiting that's been very effective at targeting yellowfin tuna in various locations. It was popularized in the Cape, chasing the large yellowfin tuna that are found in that fishery, but it's also been successfully adapted to catching yellowfin tuna here on the KZN coastline, which is the aspect that I'm going to be discussing today, giving you guys a basic overview of tackle, the equipment you need, as well as how to rig the various baits, as well as a bonus feature on a society stick bait, another way to fish a sardine for various game fish, but it works very well for the yellowfin tuna as well. So stick with me, we'll go through the basic setup that you require, as well as the more detailed work with the dead baits, and hopefully it gives you guys the tools you need to get this thing going. The first thing we'll start with, the basic tools and equipment you'll need. Most of the stuff you find generally on the boat anyway, but your most important aspect is a good sharp pair of scissors. I find these blue Gardena ones that you buy in the hardware store to be the sharpest and the best for cutting up your chum baits. You also get good ones from Worth, the tiger one and the zebra one. Those are all very sharp. You can stick to the bait knives if you like. Just when you're working with these, you know, the boat's moving and that, often you have a few slips or accidents, and you'll cut your chum a lot slower with a bait knife than cutting straight with the pair of scissors. So I'd recommend getting a good sharp pair of scissors on the boat, have it handy, and that's going to help you to cut your chum a lot easier. Obviously the infamous chum bucket is another piece that you're going to need. I like to have a ladle as well. You know, when you're working with baits and tackle and your drag lever on the reel, you don't want to have sardine slime on your hands all the time. It just helps to have a ladle to distribute the chum once you've got your chum bucket going. This is another feature that we like to use, adding anchovy oil. It comes in various brands. This is the shot for shot variety. Adding a little bit of this to your chum bucket just gives a little bit of extra oil and attractant for the fish. So that pretty much goes hand in hand with your chum bucket. When we're talking tips and tricks on traces, obviously in the Western Cape the guys are fishing a lot heavier, fishing 80 to 100 pound fluorocarbon, 8 to 10 hooks, much larger chunks. In our case, we're basically going to be looking at much smaller fish. Generally, our shoal size yellowfin are between 13 and 17 kilos on the shoalies, and when you get to the winter fish, between 25 and 30 kilos. So you're not going to need much more than a sort of a medium sort of size setup in terms of tracing. I'm a fan of circle hooks. It works extremely well for the tuna on the circle hooks with the chumming technique. Any of your mustard tuna circles in a 6-0. Even your eagle claws, these are very good tuna hooks. It's the eagle claw billfish range. I like the 7-0, which matches the mustard 6-0. Those are a good size circle hook to have. For the KZN waters, around a 6-0 is going to get you the most sort of mileage for your traces. If you're a J-hook fan, you can't beat the mustard big gun in a 6-0. And if the bite is a little bit slow or the fish are very sensitive, you can go down to a 4-0 in that. We can also look at the mustard hoodlum range. Those bigger yellowfin are around, nice heavy gauge hook, nice short shank, sharp point. These work extremely well. The only disadvantage is with a much heavier gauge like this, they tend to sink a lot faster with your chum block, and it tends to drift outside of the chum slick. So, you know, if you've got bigger fish around, go to a heavier gauge like a hoodlum, but rather try stick with a lighter gauge hook that's going to keep the chum piece drifting with the chum. So in terms of cutting the chum, there's no real rocket science here. You're going to take your sardine, make sure that they're partly defrosted or fully defrosted. And what you want to do is you want to cut off several pieces. Get between sort of 6 or 7 pieces out of a sardine. Get just behind the gill plate there like that. And then don't forget to cut through the eyes of the sardine. What that does is it breaks that air bubble in the head and allows the headpiece to sink down with the rest of the chum. What you tend to find is if you don't cut the eye, the heads that you throw in the water float to the surface, and it attracts the birds and they come and become a pest. Oftentimes they'll dive down and grab your chum piece while it's in the chum slick, and they just become a nuisance. So try cut through the head or the eyes of your bait, and that'll help that to sink. Obviously once it's all cut, that goes into the chum bucket, and you keep going until you've built up a fairly decent stock of chum pieces in your bucket, and you'll now put in your anchovy oil, mix it up, and that's what you'll be using. You'll spoon out a ladle full at a time, put it in the water, and then you'll add your chum bait to that batch of chum that's basically in the drift. So that's how you cut them up. get your 6 or 7 pieces out of it, make sure you cut through the eyes, and that gets you going. So to move on to the tracing, with the J hooks, as I mentioned, it's quite good to have, so this is a 4.0 big gun, to have a bit of a loop on it for a bit of free movement. The fluorocarbon that you can use on your J hooks, around 50 to 60 pound fluoro is normally the best. Yellowfin have got great eyesight. It helps to have fluorocarbon. Also a bit more abrasion resistant if it's rubbing on the teeth. They don't have very sharp teeth, but they're like a sandpaper type tooth that can wear through or gnaw off your leader. So what generally happens with the fish when they eat a chum piece with a J hook, they tend to swallow it. The fish goes away, you tighten up your drag, and you end up hooking the fish most of the time in the throat or in the guts. And it can be a bit easier to fight and land them because of that pressure from deep inside like that. But what you tend to find is you've got your leader protruding from the mouth, and in a long prolonged fight, especially when they're on their side in those last circles, they tend to wear through your leader. So with the J hooks, a little bit heavier on your fluorocarbon. The massive advantage of the circle hook trace over the J hook trace is that you're able to downscale on your leader size. So what I'll normally do, I'm a big fan of fishing circles for yellowfin here in KZN. You'll tend to find that you'll get away with 50 or even 40 pound fluorocarbon, obviously snelled onto the shank of the hook correctly so that the circle hook can do its job. But it allows you to fish a lot lighter, tend to get a few more pulls, and also your chum piece tends to sink better with the lighter fluorocarbon as it sinks into the chum. So that's a basic overview of the traces you'll need. I don't go much more than a meter of fluorocarbon. You don't really need to. It's just to, when that yellowfin's in the chum slick, that they don't really see anything different about your chum bait to the rest of the chum pieces. So fluorocarbon is a good bet to have. If we move on from there, type of brands that you can use, I enjoy the Siglon, but there's Maxima, there's Triple Fish fluorocarbon, there's a whole lot of different brands. As long as it's a good quality, high abrasion fluorocarbon, you should be fine. So to move on to how to cut and rig your chum pieces now, a lot of guys ask questions on what's the best part of the sardine to use. As you try to chum, you want to try as best as possible to match the sort of sizes of the actual chum pieces you're putting in the water. I like to go slightly bigger to make it stand out a little bit in the chum slick. But the easiest way to go is to just go at 45 and 45 to cut off the tail pieces, the fibers. That leaves you a nice sort of angled top like that. And then about the size of your thumb is the size that you want for your chum piece. A lot of guys will cut at a 45 or start angling it and cutting it into fancy shapes. I just tend to find that starts to spin. And once your bait starts to spin, you won't get a pull. So you'll cut it nice and straight like that. And what you'll get is a chum piece out of the tail section about the size of your thumb. So that's the piece you're going to use. To rig it up, there's 2 ways to rig it. A lot of guys, I've seen it done in the Cape quite a bit. They'll just go straight through and let the hook stick out the top. What tends to happen, it does spin a little bit, and also it's not as stealth as you might want. My favorite way to go is to hold it with the dark side on the outside. You slide your circle hook down the backbone of the bait till you're about halfway like that. You'll then pull it through like this, and once it's through, bring it around the bait and stick it into the front like that. And what happens there, it's a lot less visible. It's nice and straight along the side piece of the chum. And what tends to happen is when you feed it out, because you've got a keel made up of the hook shank, it tends to drift a lot straighter and spin a lot less with the way that the hook is lined perfectly down the middle of the chunk. The protruded part is the point of the hook just tucked into the skin on the other side. So a lot of guys will ask there, but surely the circle hook needs to protrude to be able to hook the fish. What you find is once the yellowfin eats this chum piece, it almost obliterates the chunk as it eats it, and you're left just with your circle hook protruding inside the mouth of the fish. And as you tighten up, you get the pull. So that's the way I fish them. It's nice and stealthy. It sinks very nicely with a sort of slight wobbling action, but no spinning, and that works really well. With a J hook, what you can find is when you get to that same point where you've come through like it, you're able to just bury the hook point inside the chum piece so that it's hidden even more. So from the one side, you won't see it. Also adds the weight on the bottom, and it tends to sink a lot easier. What you do want is it sticking nice and center out the top of the bait, also to stop any sort of spinning. And that's basically how to rig up your chum piece. Like I said, try keep it to a size that tends to match the rest of your chum that's in the bucket, and you'll be fine. So you'll get one chum piece out of your bait, and then you just cut the rest up and add it to the chum bucket so as not to waste. mistake a lot of guys make is that they tend to put too much chum in the water at any time, and it starts to become quite costly if you're running through a 5 kilo box every 10 minutes. You don't need a hell of a lot. Just every time you let your bait into the water, you want to make sure you've got at least a ladle of chum. Your bait is let out in that, about 25 to 30 pulls, and it straightens out, and you'll keep adding small bits of chum to the chum slick at any given time. So what that tends to do is just keep that trail of bait coming. It calls in the fish, they swim up the chum line, and eventually they're going to run into your chum bait with the hook, and that's where you're going to get your pull. So that covers that aspect. I want to cover one more aspect with you that's quite a deadly bait. It's something that works not just for yellowfin, but a lot of game fish here on the KZN coast. It's called the Society Stick Sardine. It's a little bit of a sort of deviation from your normal sard that most people will just either hook it through the lips and then let it out as a drift bait. In this case, we're trying to get a specific action out of this bait that's going to allow the maximum attraction for the fish. So this tends to be fished with the rod standing up in the gunnel, in your chum line, and it tends to be a surface bait that has a lot of flash and attraction in the water. So what you're going to do, you take a normal society stick. I mean, you can buy these at any sort of supermarket, the ones you make your societies for the braai. You hold your bait upside down. The first thing you want to do is close the mouth. So you will insert the society stick through the bottom jaw. You go through the head region, and then you can feel it scraping along the backbone of the bait, and you just keep slowly feeding it through. The goal is to keep the bait as straight as possible. You can twist a little bit as you push it, and you'll start to find as it goes further through, it'll come out eventually by the tail. And what you'll do here is you'll just cut the top piece of your sardine stick off so that it ends nice and straight, and you've got a nice rigid sardine. So they tend to be quite floppy. Normally this here is now a lot more reinforced. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your trace. For this type of fishing, it normally works better with a J hook. In this case, we're going to use a trace that's got a 6.0 big gun on it. The reason being, you've got quite a nice long shank. You've got a recurved point like that. And what you'll do is you'll see the spots on the side of the sardine. You want to come back to around about where the pick fin ends along the side of the bait as your point to insert the point of the hook. And just remember that the society stick is running underneath the skin here like this. What you'll do is you'll feed it in from the one side, you'll feel it going underneath the society stick, and you'll bring it up the other side. And what happens is you've got an offset bait that's rigged through the shoulders like this. So when you let it out, it's going to drift naturally like this. But once it comes tight against the rod that's up in the gunnel, you're going to find that it's going to sit in the water like this. And what happens is with the current in that, it tends to, you've got the loop knot here, it tends to pivot and swing and flash. And it's an absolutely deadly bait for yellowfin tuna, specifically in the chum line, but also for your dorado. Kuta have been caught on this before, your bonnies, those type of fish. Everything responds well to this. So if you're in an area where you're looking for species and you're on the drift, this is always worthwhile having out. And it certainly works well even in the chum line to get you some extra pull. So that covers the society stick bait. It's quite simple and easy to do. I think the last thing just to remind you guys is another tip or trick. If you find that the wind comes up or the current starts going a bit faster and you tend to find your chum is sinking at a certain speed and your baits are getting pulled up out of the chum line, it's often a good idea to put a 3/4 ounce or a 1 ounce little egg sinker above your trace on your leader. Just peg it with a toothpick to stop it from sliding. I like to keep it about 3 meters away from my chum piece. And what you'll find is as you start letting out the bait, it tends to stay a lot better with the chum line as it's going through. With a small egg sinker like this, it helps you to get some more pulls. Well guys, that's the basics of chumming in KZN waters. It's a technique I reckon you guys should definitely give it a bash if you haven't before. You know, we get those shoal size fish most of the year, but in winter those fish between 25 and 30 kilos are around, and this is certainly a deadly way to prospect new waters and get yourself a new personal best yellowfin tuna. So I hope this has helped you guys, and get out there, give it a try, tight lines.